Good morning, everybody. I think that was set for Adam, but anyway. Welcome to the August Oral History Talk, and firstly I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Adam Page and his son Charlie. Charlie didn't want to miss his dad's induction into the human library. Similar to other speakers, Adam was not born in Tasmania, and the reasons for his coming and staying are of interest to us. And from the community's perspective, it is to our great advantage that he made that decision. Adam's contribution is in many areas. He's an entertainer, and I think you'll see that firsthand. He's a singer, a musician, and a host of public events, sort of an MC for Launceston. He works in aged care, and he's come to that profession fairly late in his life, and he's a wonderful asset to it. So contrary to negative stories that we've all heard, the horror stories of aged care, he provides an exemplary example, and it's obvious when you see the residents that he works with just how pleased they are to have him in their midst. I first knew of Adam when I joined his Facebook group, Humans of Launceston. Does anyone else follow that? Yeah, great. How many have you got, Adam?
37,000, yeah.
37,000, right. Here he tells the story of remarkable people who otherwise would go unknown except for their immediate family. Indeed, many families are amazed to discover some of the details. And perhaps they've never asked the right questions. Perhaps they've never taken the time to listen. But Adam does, and it's great. I've also heard, though not witnessed, that Adam is a wonderful master of ceremonies at public events. His entertaining control of trivia nights and quizzes, for example, are becoming quite legendary. I haven't been to any of Adam's musical performances, an omission I hope to correct. Maybe here today. But again, I hear they're great fun. He does over 100 gigs a year in a range of venues. Recently, a very dear friend of mine has become one of the residents at Cadorna House where Adam works. And I've seen Adam at work there. That's what I was talking about before. So I know firsthand how much he is appreciated for his care, his wit, his energy, and the dedication he puts in to his job. My friend, for example, talks about how he makes life interesting and fun, which is great when you think of all the negative stuff we hear. We were hoping to have some residents here today, but unfortunately the aged care, the places in Tasmania providing aged care have been in lockdown for 2 weeks since that intruder from the mainland decided he'd come here for a few minutes, and then they come out of lockdown tomorrow. But let's hear from Adam himself. Thank you, Adam.
Good morning, everybody. How are we? All right, now I need to firstly say that I've come completely unprepared. I have no notes or anything. I've got a few photos, but I think that's a good way of doing it for me because I pretty much enter people's houses and expect the same from them when I interview them. So I thought I'll put myself on the spot and I'll just talk naturally and hopefully it'll flow. Hopefully you'll get a laugh here or there, and it's also an honour to be here today, so I just wanted to say thank you to Jill for inviting me. I've been in I've been in Launceston now for about 11 years. 2010 I moved here. And I suppose today I'd like to talk about, maybe in the format I do when I do an interview with someone for Humans of Launceston, which is birth to now, basically, because I'm very interested in how people get to where they are today, not just geographically, but in their life. And that's something that I find fascinating with aged care as well, and speaking with elderly people about their lives and their journeys and their sadness and their triumphs and all that, and the things that led us to this point in their lives, really. So I'm a Geelong boy. Yes, I am a Cats supporter. I was born in 1971. My mother was a nurse for 50 years and my father was a truck driver for 50 years. And they're both retired now and living miserably in lockdown constantly in Geelong. But I grew up on the Bellarine Peninsula down near Queenscliff in a little place called Drysdale. And it was a wonderful little town to grow up in. And I had just, your run-of-the-mill childhood, really. And my parents, I think my father was an interstate truck driver, so he wasn't around a great deal when I was young. And so Mum was always there, and she's a fantastic mum, and I think a lot of the empathy and compassion that I have as an adult, I can credit to my mum, that's for sure. So with Humans of Launceston in particular, it started really by accident. I've always loved storytelling, and I've always loved telling the odd story and listening to other people's stories. So what led me to that point really was meeting a gentleman in Newstead named Willem de Boer. And I'll go back to my childhood because Willem reminded me instantly of my grandfather, who was actually my step-grandfather. He was Dutch, and he was a very heavy smoker, and he had a very strong accent. And when I met Willem, he reminded me a lot of my pop, who passed away in the late 90s. And we just had this instant connection. And when I spoke to him, it was actually, I met him at the Coles in Newstead, and he was sitting on a park bench. And sometimes when you see people sitting out in public, and you can just tell they're just waiting for someone to come and say good day, but perhaps they don't. And he was watching everyone that walked past, and no one was stopping. And so I did, and I sat down. I said, "How are you, sir?" And he said, "Oh, not so good today." And so I got talking to him, and he was a fascinating man. And he said, one thing he said to me that resonated with me instantly was, "My stories will go with me to the grave. No one cares anymore. My family don't care. They've heard all my stories, and they don't even ask me questions anymore." And so I said to him, "Would you mind if I sat down with you and wrote down your story? I'd really like to. I think that people would be fascinated by your story." And he said, "I'm not sure, but yes, okay." And I could tell that he was actually very keen, so I did. I sat down with him, and it ended up, I wasn't too sure what kind of a story I was going to get, but I knew that everyone has a story, and I know that everyone in this room has a story. And so he sat down and he said, "Well, I have 11 children, and I'm a world-renowned pathologist, and I've got a lot of stories to tell. Have you got the time?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And I wasn't sure if I did, but I'd make sure I did, because I said that, and I did. And I sat down with him over a period of about 8 or 9 hours over 3 different sittings. He lived at an aged care home in Norwood. And I sat down with him, and he told me his story, which was basically his first marriage. He had 7 children, and his second marriage he had 4 children. And his children all grew up to be doctors, pathologists, veterinarians, very successful in their careers. He'd been through the war. He'd lived in Sumatra as a pathologist. His story was amazing, and I said to him, "Do you mind if I post it on my Facebook page," which was just my own personal page, just for my friends to read. Would you mind that? And he said, not at all. He said, well, heaps of people read it. And I said, yes. And he goes, well, go on, yeah, that'd be great. And eventually I got the idea to start a Facebook page predominantly about storytelling, and I thought Willem would be the ideal first story. And I posted his story. I started the page, I posted his story and a couple of others in the meantime. And within, I think it was 3 weeks, I had 10,000 followers. And I could tell that the passion and the hunger for storytelling from people out there was very much there, very evident. And I could see straight away from the comments, the reception that his story got, that a public forum for people's stories was very important. And so as I progressively posted his 3-part story, the interest in it, the Examiner were calling, the ABC were doing interviews with me and Willem, because of not only his story, but I think the reaction of the public to hearing just an honest story about his failures, his success, you know, his family, what led him to Launceston. And that's something that fascinates me when I'm talking to people, whether or not you're born here, how did you end up here, and all those sorts of things. And he actually moved here when he was 95, Willem, and I said, where were you living? He goes, I was living in WA and all I was doing was betting on the horses all day, and my son said, you need to come down to Tassie, Dad, and live here and see out your last few years. We'll look after you. So he did, and he moved here and moved into an aged care home, and he was very happy in his last few years. He died about a year after I posted his story, and I went to his funeral, and they used his story as a eulogy, which for me was a huge honour. And that's gone on to happen probably 15 to 20 times where they've used my story as a eulogy. And the privilege that I feel when that has happened, I can't really describe, because it's validating people's lives in some way, and it's validating their own story. And when I think about my own story, quite a few people have said to me, when are you going to do your own story? And I said, well, I don't think anyone would believe it, to tell you the truth, but maybe one day if someone has the inkling, I'm happy to sit down. But in my early 20s, I worked in shearing sheds. I worked as a truck driver. I did all the jobs that my father did, because that's what I thought I should do. And none of them made me happy. And I went to live in Western Australia for 8 years and Darwin for a year, and travelled around and still hadn't found my niche, you could say. And then I started working as a disability carer in the human services area. And I realised that sitting in a truck or holding a stop and go sign or picking up wool in a shearing shed didn't give me the connection with people that I craved. And I decided to then go back to school and work out really what I wanted to do. So in my early 30s, I was a single man, living in Geelong in a little place on my own, and I was on a bit of a fitness kick. I'd put on a lot of weight, and I realised that I wasn't going to live a very long life unless I changed my life. So I weighed nearly 200 kilos at one stage, and I used to have trouble walking downstairs. So I had to do something. My doctor said I had to do something, so I did. And every night I'd walk down the Bowen River, along the Bowen River, and I got healthy. And I was working as a youth worker, and I met a girl who was working as a nurse at the Geelong Hospital. And I said, where are you from? And she said, Mole Creek. And I said, where? She goes, Mole Creek, and I thought she was lying. And no, she was from Mole Creek, and we became a couple, and we, I'll be honest with you, we became in the family way very quickly, and Charlie was born. And it's funny because Zoe and I got together and realised we had to get serious. We're having a child and we need to do the proper thing and move in together and do all that. And then Charlie was due at the end of July in 2007. And he was due on the Friday, and on the Wednesday night, I won Tats Lotto, Division 1. And we had $14 in the bank at the time. And Charlie's grandmother was staying with us at the time. She was over from West Launceston, and I said, I think I've won Tats Lotto. And she went, "Pfft." Yeah, sure. And I said to Zoe, I think I've won Tats Lotto. And Zoe went, really? So we checked the tickets and we went down to the newsagents because the ticket was right, the numbers were right. So we went down. And I'll just tell you this because it is a funny story. So when you win Tats Lotto Division 1, which I didn't know, there's a procedure, and that procedure is they have to not say anything, they just have to ask you out the back if you'd like a cup of coffee, and they sit you down and then they tell you. They're not allowed to tell you in store, so that's what they did. And I took the ticket in, that's what they were supposed to do. I took the ticket in and she put the ticket through the machine and did this big alarm bell thing. And she said, oh my God, you've won Division 1. And I said, shh. And everyone in the shop started coming over. And she said, oh, I can't believe it. You've won Division 1. I said, I know, how much? I want to know how much, please. And she went, oh, I'll just have a look. And she went, oh no, like this. I said, what's wrong? She goes, oh, it's one of the lowest prize pools I've ever seen, and there's 2 winners. You haven't won much, I'm so sorry. I said, how much? She said, oh, $67,500. And I went, great. And I hugged Zoe and we were very happy. And we went home and I had this special box, a wooden box, and we put the Tats Lotto ticket in the box and stuck it up the back of the freezer. Because she could have gone into labour at any time. So on the Friday she went into labour and Charlie was born. It was one of the greatest moments of my life up until that point, definitely. And we cried and we soaked in everything that comes with the birth of your first child. And on the Sunday, Zoe said, didn't you win Tats Lotto? I went, oh yeah. Just completely forgot, just went out the window. So that was good. We bought a little house just out of Geelong, and it was great. You know, we ended up living out in the bush where I'd always wanted to live, just out of Geelong in Inverleigh. But eventually, with being a new mum and still working and all that was too hard, so we had to move back into town. And we went on to have Amara, our daughter, 18 months, 2 years later. And just after Amara was born, Zoe said, I'd really love to be around my family. And what would you consider moving to Tasmania? And at that stage, I had a very successful band, I had a full-time job, all my friends and family were there, my niece and nephew, and I was a bit hesitant, but I realised that it was probably really important for our family to do that, so we did. And within 6 weeks, we were living up the top of West Launceston at my mother-in-law's house. Now you might think to yourself, oh, that's lovely. Don't ever move in with your mother-in-law. She's a lovely lady, but yeah. It was an interesting time. And I'll just tell you this very funny story just before I move on. One time I was giving the kids a bath at my mother-in-law's house, as I did each night. And there was this bubble bath, and it was in a little plastic bubble instead of a bottle. And it wouldn't pop open. I was trying to get it in the bath and I was squeezing it that hard and it still wouldn't burst. And so I gave it one more go and it shot out like a bullet straight into my eye. Now, my mother-in-law took me to the hospital and I had a little bit of plastic in there and they had to flush it out. And my eye was like out here a bit and really red and I was in a lot of pain. And I dozed off for about 5 minutes and I woke up to my mother-in-law with her phone in my face taking a photo, laughing her head off. And I said, what are you doing, Janice? And she goes, you just look so stupid. Yeah, so that's a terrible story. I shouldn't have brought it up. No. Anyway, so I was in Tasmania, which I loved instantly, and I missed my family, and but the beauty of Tasmania and the people and how welcoming they were was something that I just hadn't experienced. Although I'd lived all over Australia, I felt that Tasmania had something very special. And I don't regret moving here. Even though Zoe and I split up about a year later, we've stayed close and, life goes on. So what happened after we split up was she came to me and said, I bought a house today. And I said, I bought a little flat today. And she said, where did you buy? I said, in Hillside Crescent in West Launceston. Where did you buy yours? And she goes, in Hillside Crescent, West Launceston. So we ended up being neighbours for the next few years, which worked out great because we were still, going away with the kids and doing stuff together. But it was, really good. So eventually, excuse me, I moved out of that flat because I was going back to Geelong every few months and I was doing gigs over there, singing with the old band I used to have. And I ran into my old boss named Louise and we clicked and we were in the family way very quickly. Okay, so it's a little bit of a pattern. Yes. And Louise moved down here and we had Jeb, who's my 6-year-old son, and we ended up renting a house, and Jeb was born in 2014. And what's funny, that was 7 years ago now, and my marriage to Louise actually ended at the start of this year. So now I had to move, when I was due to move out of the house. As you know, there's a bit of a housing shortage here in Tasmania, and trying to find a house was going to be very problematic for me, and I was very worried about it. And then my first wife rang up and said, I've got a house for rent if you want it. And it was the house in Hillside Crescent, where my children grew up, and it worked out very well. So I now live there, and on the door jamb as you walk in is the heights of all my children as they grew, of Charlie and Amara. And it made me think about how life works and comes full circle. And I'm happy, and I've got 3 beautiful children, and I live in Tasmania, which I feel very privileged about. I just love it here. We take in everything that Tasmania has to offer, nature-wise, community-wise, and I just love it. So that's sort of how I ended up in Tasmania, and through meeting the girl from Mole Creek, and I don't regret it for a day. So I'm very happy to be here. So can I just, with the photo, just do the arrow? Okay. All right, so I'll talk about Humans of Launceston first. I've interviewed over 160 people now, and through that experience, it's changed my life in many, many ways. Some of the people that I've met have taught me a lot about life, about acceptance, about who I am and how I see myself. It's been a very rewarding experience for me as a person. I don't know if you can see down the bottom corner, there's a gentleman there, his name's Joe. And I interviewed Joe for Humans of Launceston, and he lived in the aged care home where I was working at the time in Aldersgate in Kings Meadows. And from then on, he came to all my gigs, mainly the ones at the casino or the Italian club. And he would dance all night. He always was smiling. Everyone loved Joe. And I'd pick him up, I'd drop him off. And I can honestly say that he became one of my closest friends. He was a very wise man. He'd been there and done that, and he also taught me a lot. And he's still with us. He has pretty severe dementia now, and he doesn't remember me, but that doesn't matter. He still gives me a smile and says, "Hey, pal, how you going?" And he's a lovely man. And out of the 160 people that I've interviewed, I can honestly say I have a story about each one of them that would take an hour each. I could tell you about. Obviously, I can't do that. Now, some of those people, there's a gentleman there, excuse me, on the second row. See the first man? His name was Niels, and I just happened to do my placement after I went back to TAFE out at Escaley, and he was staying there for only 6 weeks. And I found him a fascinating person. I ended up doing a Humans of Launceston story on him, and he had basically, his mother had got a parasite in her eye travelling around South Africa. The parasite was called lower, and apparently it stays in your system for years dormant, and then all of a sudden it can just come out and it can affect you in a very detrimental way. So after having this parasite living in her eye for 15 years, she suddenly lost all of her hair. She had to go into a wheelchair. She lost use of all of her limbs, and it went on to affect his life. His older brother died in a head-on car crash through a drink driver in Perth, in WA. And then Niels was one of the youngest CEOs of a mining company in Western Australia. And he went on to also be in a car accident caused by a drink driver. And he has a intellectual disability now, can communicate very well, is very intelligent. But his story was just fascinating, and it was one of those stories that taught you about, appreciating what you've got in life and how good you have it, really, because some people don't and have had many tragic events happen in their life. The man next to him was Fred Mace. I don't know if you know the name Mace up in Prospect. He was a fascinating man. Pretty much all of the top of Prospect he used to own as a farm, and then he sold it off to the real estate agent Bushby's back in the 70s, and he lived in his house on the corner of Mace Street and Prospect Road up until his death about 3 years ago. But he was a wonderful man, and I felt I was very privileged to meet him as well. Here's some of the other people. Daniel Gill up there in the top, the Australian Boxing Championship. The lady in the top there, photo, Jill, she wrote the TV series The Gloaming, which is currently on Foxtel, and also the Kettering incident, which was based in Tasmania, and she was a fascinating lady to speak to. Down the bottom is, of course, Joseph Cromie. He was a wonderful man to meet and to go to his house at the old hospital site in his apartment was a great experience for me. And it's funny because when I walked in, he had this beautiful hallway with mirrors and these beautiful wine cellars. And he had one wine cellar actually, but he had these mirrors positioned, and he said, you'll stand there and look there. And so I did. And he said, see, 3 wine cellars. And I said, sorry? And he goes, they're 1, 2, 3. Because they were all reflecting in the mirrors. But he only had one. And he laughed that much. He thought it was the funniest thing. And he said, every time somebody come in, I do the same. Ha, ha, ha. I was like, okay, no worries, Joe. A fascinating man and done so much for the community. The man down the bottom there, the third there, is Willem de Boer, the first man that I interviewed. And that's Joe there smiling, always smiling. And Joseph Cromie, I know that he's had a lot of airtime and media and all that, but I think I got a lot of things out of him that he's never told anybody before about his childhood and fleeing his native country during wartime and establishing himself here in Tasmania and how he did it. And that's what I'm about. But when I say that he's had a lot of exposure, and, I really enjoy putting a spotlight on people who would not have any media attention, who maybe feel isolated, lonely, unheard. They're the people that I really like to focus on. So I've really steered away from people. I was approached by a very wealthy business developer here in Launceston to do his story, and I very politely declined, only because I really wanted to concentrate on people who perhaps, do go unheard and would really love to have their stories told. And the reaction that my stories get, because I always go back to the recipient and I always read the comments that people have made and tell them how many people have liked it and how viral it's gone. And they love it. The feeling that the people get about being heard and about people listening to their story is one of the greatest gifts in my life. And there's nothing else I could do that would give me more satisfaction than the reaction I get from people when you tell them 100,000 people read their story and they're like, what, really? And it's amazing, really. So I did a story on a lady, I'm not sure if she's on here, she should be. And she was 107. Her name was Chloe Dunlop. She was actually she just turned 107 when I met her, and she eventually became the oldest lady in Australia, and she died at 109 at the start of last year, just before COVID hit. And she was the most amazing lady to talk to. She had a really good recall, but sometimes I have to get the family to help me fill in a few gaps, which I did with her. But I told her, I went back to read the comments and all that, and she said, how many people? And I said, 4.5 million people read your story over the last 3 months. It went viral, and a few people, big Facebook pages in America, posted it, and that's why I think it's just gone bang. And she was so happy, and she had a little cry, and her daughter was there too, and her daughter, who's not even her oldest daughter, was 87. She wasn't even her oldest child. So, she was a lovely lady, and when she passed away, it was a very sad time, but they used her story that I did on her as a eulogy. But I found it fascinating, and I don't say this in any way against the family, but I found it fascinating that no one in the family with so many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, had the inkling to write down what she had to say. One of the oldest people, certainly in this state, one of the pioneers of Mayfield, one of the first residents of Mayfield, and knew everything about the history of the floods. And it's funny, this is how old this lady was. She said in the 1929 Launceston floods, she was due to give birth, and her husband had to pick her up, take her out the front window of her mum's house in Brisbane Street and put her in a boat and rowed her to the hospital to give birth during the floods. And I said, hang on, you were giving birth in 1929? She's like, yeah. And that's when I realised this lady is old. And but it was a wonderful experience to meet her, and also the reaction that her family got from their, nana and grandmother, all that going viral around the world and certainly around Tasmania was fantastic. What I'm trying to do at the moment is, because I've kept Humans of Launceston at just me, when I've tried to get people to help me out to write a story because I was too busy or had others to do, it just hasn't worked. And so I'm very certain that I just want to do it as a one-man thing. But what I would really like to do is encourage other people in the community to write down the stories of the elderly people in their families or their own. I think it's vital, and what I'm trying to do at the moment is go around to schools. I've got one on Friday at Queechee High School, and I want to encourage young people to sit down with your grandparents or your great-grandparents and talk to them, video them, but before they die, get it down, because once they're gone, it goes with them. It's really important. So what I'd like to do is turn humans of Launceston into a community spirit, and get those people to, what I do, where I might post 1 or 2 a month, have dozens and dozens of stories being posted of local people telling their stories. Okay. That's me with a few of them. That's Chloe up in the top there. I've got my sideburns dyed black because I was doing my Elvis impersonation era, going up to the Parks Elvis Festival every year, representing Tasmania, and that was just after it. So I had black hair, and I looked ridiculous. But anyway, I miss those sideys. That's me with just a few of them. That fella there in the second row on the left, his name is Alf Stackhouse, and he was a pioneer of Flinders Island, and he's such a fascinating man. And I went around and spoke to him, and the stories that he had about Flinders Island, Cape Barren Island, flying planes, crashing planes, being a farmer, leasing land, Badger Island, all those islands, he'd been there for 65 years, basically, raised his family there. Absolutely fascinating man. Also another person whose family didn't write anything or didn't even really ask him anything about it, because when they read the story, they said, wow, we didn't know that. Wow, we didn't know that. And, it doesn't make me sad. It just makes me wonder why. Because that man had a book in him. If he had someone with the inkling to sit down for long enough to write a book, he was one of the great humans of Launceston. He really was. And he died 6 months after I did his story. And again, they used his story at his eulogy, and now they want to bring out a book on their grandfather, their father, because what I did with him inspired them, and they realised how interesting he actually was when you spoke to him. The gentleman up the top on the third, it'd be Bobby Wilson. I really was fascinated about interviewing someone Indigenous here in Launceston. And Bobby, I know, as a local musician, country singer. He's actually from New South Wales originally, but moved down here in the 90s to work at Centrelink, and has now gone on to do a lot of proactive stuff in the Aboriginal community here in Launceston. And his story was a wonderful story about respect, racism, prejudice, acceptance, his love for his family and everybody and his children. And it was just a really great experience for me to be a part of. And this gentleman down here on the bottom, Rex Burr, I'd just like to quickly tell you about him before I just move on to the aged care stuff. Rex was living in an aged care home in Norwood, and I just happened to walk past his door after interviewing another lady, and he was on the, the breather through your nose. I can't think of it now. And he did not look a very well man at all. He's very pale. He was grey. His face was grey, actually. And I just knocked on his door and I just said, "G'day," really. And he had a canary in his room, and we talked about the canary. And he asked me what I was doing there, and I explained that I was there to interview a lady. And he goes, "What do you interview them for?" And I said, "Just about their life." And he goes, "Would you do that for me?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, you got to hurry because I've stopped eating, and I've stopped drinking, and I've stopped taking me pills. So I reckon you've got probably 10 days, and I'm out because I've had enough." And I said, "All right, well, let's do it right now." And he told me this wonderful story about when he was a baby, 6 months old he was, his mum was walking through the bush up at Goshen near Pyengana, got bit by a snake and died there on the ground. And so his father had 4 other children and couldn't raise them on his own. So Rex went to live with his nana in Invermay in Bryant Street. And he told all these great stories about, riding his bike around the streets of Invermay, and this girl he had a crush on, for some reason, picked up a piece of wood and threw it at him, and it hit him in the hip. And he said, "I just knew that day that I had to be around my dad. I was sick of it." And he goes, "My hip was really sore." And he goes, "And I said to my nana, I'm going to find Dad." And he goes, and he was working out the back of New Namara somewhere. It was about 15 k's from Launceston. And he goes, "I knew the direction." And he goes, "I looked at the mountains. I thought, I've got to go over there." And he goes, and I just rode my bike. And he goes, I jumped fences, I went through rivers, I went over mountains. And he goes, it took me all night. I slept in the bush. And he goes, and I got to Nunamara and I said, do you know where this family live? And they said, yep, you got to go over that hill, up that road, down there. And he was only 9 years old. Found his way to his father, and his father said, you can stay here from now on. So he lived on the farm with his father. But his story was, it did go viral, and it was a wonderful story. And when I went back into reading the comments, he was just, beside himself, really. And he cried and he laughed, and he started taking his medication, and he started eating, and he started drinking. And I said to him, I'm actually having a Humans of Launceston meet and greet where a group of people will come to the Italian Club in Prospect. I'll be playing a bit of music, and you're welcome to come. I'd really love you to come. And he came, and he had his gas tank next to him with his breather. He had a carer on the other side. And it was a wonderful night. And he said to me at the end of the night, he goes, I feel like a rock star. I can die now because I know what it feels like to be a rock star. And he did. He died a month later, and he went on to live another 8 months after I first met him, which was great. But he died about a month after the meet and greet. And I went to his funeral, and it was a fantastic experience. I ended up reading his story at his funeral, which was, once again, a huge honour for me. And, as I said, I could tell you that lady up in the top corner, Molly, she was a Beaconsfield girl, and she moved to Sydney when she was 21 and got married, and moved back to Beaconsfield when she was 99. Would you believe her daughter was still living in Beaconsfield, and said, Mum, move down. So she did. She was 99 and she lived to 102. And she was 4'1", I think. I don't know if you can tell the height difference, but she was tiny. So anyway, Humans of Launceston has been a wonderful experience for me to be a part of. And it's something that I'll be continuing to do. This year, I've had a pretty rough year, and I actually have only posted a few stories. But I've just been and spoke to another lady recently, so I'll be posting a story very shortly and back into the swing of it. So keep your eyes peeled, and I hope to bring out a book next year. That's my goal with Humans of Launceston, is to bring out a coffee table style book that people can see themselves in, and that's the ultimate end game for me for Humans of Launceston. Okay, now moving into aged care. I went back to school, as I said, to TAFE, to do nursing because I wanted to follow in my mum's footsteps, because truck driving just didn't work out for me. I got the sack a couple of times. I couldn't concentrate too much. If you want me to stand up here and say, oh, it was great, I'm not. I was not that good at it, and I didn't really like it. So I decided to become a nurse, like my mum. So I went back to school and did the nursing course, and after 6 months, I was overwhelmed with the information and the body parts and all the names you had to remember, and I realised that I was in a bit deep. So I was about to pull out when my teacher said, Adam, you have to stay in human services. You've got the gift, and if you go back to being in a truck, we're going to pull you out of it and make sure you work in either aged care or disability. So I did. I changed over, did the 6-month course, got a job at Kings Meadows in Aldersgate for a couple of years as an assistant, which I loved. I did a few human stories on people who lived there. It was a great job. Now I work full-time at Cadorna House in Riverside, up in Cormiston Road. It's a very small facility, 33 residents. It's privately owned, so it's different to any other aged care home in Tasmania. Not many of them are privately owned. My bosses are wonderful people, and our residents are very well looked after. And when I first got a job there, 3 weeks later, COVID hit, and we went into lockdown for 4 months, and we weren't allowed to leave the facility. So it was baptism by fire, you could say, and I had to come up with an activity inside every day. No bus trips, no outings. And it was very difficult for the residents as well, who were very social. So we did this, and we put up signs, and the ABC picked up on it. And all the residents put up funny signs like send beer, Bogues, not Corona. And it was wonderfully received. So my boss was happy because I'd only just started there and I got all this media exposure. I started an art therapy course, and the majority of the residents have never painted, or not since childhood. And it was fascinating to watch them and their reactions to the artwork and hanging it on their wall in their rooms, and to hear them say, I've never ever painted, or I've never done anything of a creative bent at all, and then to do some of these quality artworks was fascinating. And I had a friend that worked at West Tamar Council, and she said, did you know that every month they have a art exhibition for a local artist? And if I can talk them into it, would you be interested in your residents having their artwork displayed? And I said, yes, I'd be very interested. So that's what we did. We had an art exhibition at the West Tamar Council offices in April. It was very well received. We sold a few paintings, and the opening was all la-di-da, and the residents loved it, and they all felt on top of the world seeing their art in a public area that was for sale. So they'd come a long way. That was after a year of art, and yeah, it's a very rewarding experience for me and them. That gentleman at the top, Jim, he'd never painted in his life, ever done anything like that. He just worked on the railways for 56 years, that's what he said. That's all I've done. Anyway, so he painted that at the top, and that ended up getting in the art exhibition, and he ended up selling it, and he was stoked. This is just some photos of some of the things we do in the aged care facility. You'll see that guy there eating the ice cream. Don't worry about him, he's an idiot. Yeah, so we get her out all over, really. We go within a couple of hours. We've been up to the Snow, the Highland Lakes, Devonport. We get her out and about a lot, and they're a very social mob, really. We have quite a few residents with dementia, and obviously the program that I devise is inclusive of everybody, even those people who don't leave their rooms. So there's something for everybody, but we have a lot of highly intelligent residents who are very switched on. So we do a lot of trivia, mind games, you know, those sort of things, keep them stimulated, especially at the moment where we're also not allowed out during the last 3 weeks of lockdown. So it's all about keeping the residents stimulated, motivated, socialising. The socialisation aspect of it is very important. And even if people choose not to be social, we still try and encourage them to at least have a conversation at least once a day with somebody. And it's very important. So that's some of the signs we wrote during lockdown. Yeah, toilet roll for sale, $25. We thought we could make a bit of extra cash here. There was none in the supermarkets. Yeah, so it's all about having fun. Dress up day. And we go out for lunch a lot. Barbecues. This is the place. When I get old, it's where I want to live. Trust me, they have a good life. And that's the rock and roll diner down at Deloraine. And oh yeah, that's Doug Harris. Doug Harris is a wonderful man. Lives there. He was part of the Launceston City Band for 60 years as a trumpet player, and has taught many, many kids in Launceston how to play the trumpet. Some of them are very competent and have gone on to great things, and also a wonderful gentleman. So that's the art exhibition at the West Tamar Council, and that's Doug down the bottom with his wife and daughter. That's one of his paintings behind him. And he's a very talented man, very talented painter, had never done it, but turned out to be a natural. Yep. So we've got a great view up there. I'm not trying to sell this as an advertisement for Corona House, just, you know, when you get to that stage of your life, come to us. I don't mean that. I was just talking about, you know, finding a niche in life is something that I've found myself, and that's in aged care. It's dealing with people it's providing them an opportunity to have a good quality of life, even though they might not be necessarily living where they want to be living, you know. All right. I think that's about it, really. Oh, this is a program we did with the pen pals with the kids, and we took a few things. That was actually during lockdown, so none of the residents could come, but we took some Lego displays and showed the kids. So we're getting that intergenerational thing happening in the aged care home with 6-year-olds and people in their 80s and 90s, and it's working really well. So hopefully once the lockdown thing settles again, we can have the kids back to visit us, because the residents just love them. And that's it. Yeah, so basically, between Humans to Launceston and my job, I hang around with a lot of old people, and I love it. They are the most fascinating members of our community, I believe. So thank you very much.
Could I mention something about Joe?
Yes.
How he loved his dancing and how popular he was. I can remember at the City Park one time with the band was playing in the rotunda, whatever.
Yep.
And he was dancing, hardly moving, but by the end of the day, as soon as the band started up with a song, there was women running towards him to get there to dance with him.
Yeah.
Would you believe?
Yeah.
He's so popular. Lovely man.
Oh, lovely man. At the casino, it was the same. The women would just be all around him. He was 92, but he danced with them all, and he put his hand behind their back, and he'd just look at them and smile. And they loved him. And he'd say, "You look beautiful tonight, darling." Then he'd go on to the next one. "Ah, you look beautiful tonight, darling." Yeah, he's a wonderful man. Yeah.
They were flocking to dance with him.
Yeah.
I was amazed.
Yeah.
Good on. He was a lovely man. We know him well.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we do from Aldersgate.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
It just came to mind when I saw his photograph.
You gave permission to Ali Mercer to do Humans of Dorset.
Yes,
She's doing an amazing job,
she is.
and I'm part of the History Society from up there, and it is adding so much more to our repertoire with her doing that, so thank you.
No worries, thank you. She does do a great job. I've read some fantastic stories from there.
I had a few years on Flinders Island, and we always tried to find out from Alf, because he used to fly from Flinders over to his little island, and there was a story that he had to get an extension ladder over there which wouldn't fit in the plane. And we still don't know, to the best of my knowledge, whether he strapped that ladder to the wings or the fuselage or how he got it there, but he got it there.
Yeah, right.
And also, while I was there, I met a guy who was known as Brother Bob. You mentioned him too. And the Aboriginal guy that went to Senecare or wherever, I think. Yeah,
Bob Wilson, yeah.
Yeah, and I ran into him only not so long ago up at Trevellyn in the chemist shop, and
Yeah, right.
he's a great guy.
Fantastic man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And Alf Stackhouse, his story was amazing. The start of the story was he offered a guy a lift home that he knew from the island. He knew him quite well, and he said, as we were landing, a wind come off Mount Martha and turned the plane sideways, and I landed on the wing, and it just went bang straight into the ground, caught fire. This bloke took off out of the plane and jumped into a bush, and he goes, even though he lived on the island, I never ever saw him ever again. But he got out all right, fixed the plane, and they were fine. Yeah.
There was an article about him not so long ago in the Examiner.
Yeah.
And he used to carry sheep over to the island too in the plane, apparently.
Yeah.
And he used to have the sheep in there and his kids in there too, some of the children. And apparently the aviation regulations said that you weren't allowed to carry passengers. He was allowed to carry sheep, but not the passengers. And he used to fly around the airport on the island, or his strip on the island, just to see if anybody from the aviation industry was there to greet him. And if they were, he'd pull up at the end of the runway and tell the kids to hop out and rush into the bush, and then he'd taxi back with the sheep on board.
We're talking about good old days.
Yeah, good old days when the laws didn't matter too much. Any other questions?
Okay, we might leave it there then.
No worries.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure I speak for all of you here and say what a wonderful experience it has been today to listen to Adam. And I'm sure looking at the colour of the hair of the audience, the reassurance about Cadorna House is good to have as well. Certainly you've been a great example of what it can mean to people to be kind to them, and I hope we'll all take away that message from us. And if, as we're most of us on the receiving end of wanting to tell our stories, perhaps encouraging ourselves, other people to ask us questions or to write it down. Anyhow, Adam, again, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
And I'd ask you all to join with me in thanking Adam.
Thank you.